Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. Let's tackle two topics today. First, the recent developments in the Mike Flynn case, where Mike Flynn's defense attorneys are trying to get an appellate court to tell Judge Sullivan he has to dismiss Mike Flynn's case. And then let's also talk about the new development in the firing of the State Department Inspector General, Steve Linick. Donald Trump fired him on Friday, but we learned some really interesting things today, courtesy of Donald Trump's loose lips at a press conference, that sheds a whole new light on what's going on there. But let's start with the Mike Flynn case. So a quick recap. We know that Mike Flynn lied to the FBI, went into court and pled guilty to it because he was guilty. And then Bill Barr and the Attorney General for the District of Columbia, Tim Shea, swooped in and tried to convince Judge Sullivan to dismiss Mike Flynn's case. In a very real sense, Bill Barr is now firmly aligned with Mike Flynn's defense team, and there is no real prosecutor in the case representing the interests of the people, which is the job of a prosecutor. So Judge Sullivan appointed an outside attorney, an outside prosecutor of sorts. His name is John Gleason, former federal prosecutor in New York, former federal district court judge in New York, to come in and argue on behalf of the people that Mike Flynn's case should not be dismissed. And the Mike Flynn defense team is livid. They really want this case dismissed. So they petitioned the appellate court. They filed something called a writ of mandamus. It's a really unusual kind of appeal. It's one that we rarely use in our criminal practice. And here's why. Because a writ of mandamus is designed to address basically a lawless judge. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So a writ of mandamus is only used if a judge is violating the law or is failing to perform a clearly established legal duty. If that happens, a defendant can file this petition to the appellate court to try to get the appellate court to say, will you please order the judge to act lawfully and do what he is required to do under the law and under the rules of procedure? Here is an example of how a judge might act lawlessly that would actually give rise appropriately to the need for a writ of mandamus. Let's assume that a judge conducts a trial of a defendant on one charge. That one charge carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison. The defendant is convicted, and now we're at sentencing, and the judge says, I know that this crime that you're convicted of only carries up to 5 years in prison, but you really irritated me during the trial, so I'm going to give you 6 years. I'm going to give you an extra year. That would be unlawful. And the defendant could file a petition for a writ of mandamus asking the appellate court, please tell the judge to act lawfully. And I'm not going to talk about direct appeals and how that is how we might handle a case once it's been resolved. But that's an example of just how lawless a judge has to act, or just what a clear departure from an established legal duty a judge would have to perpetrate in order for an appellate court to entertain a writ of mandamus. So in this case, the problem is Judge Sullivan is not acting lawlessly. He's not violating the rules or an established legal duty. In fact, he's following the rule. Rule 48A of the Rules of Criminal Procedure. Let me read what it says. So Rule 48A governs a motion to dismiss filed by the prosecutor. And it says that it's titled Dismissal by the Government, government meaning the prosecutor. It says the government may, with leave of court, dismiss an indictment, an information, or a complaint. So the government may, with leave of court, if the judge grants the motion, then the prosecution may dismiss the case. Now, because the rule says it's up to the judge with leave of court, it's the judge's discretion, that proves Judge Sullivan is acting in accordance with the rule. If the rule said if the prosecution files a motion to dismiss, the judge shall grant the motion with no questions asked, well then Judge Sullivan would have to grant the motion. With leave of court means it's up to the discretion of the judge. I read the long, ridiculous brief that the defense filed in support of asking the appellate court to dismiss the case or order Judge Sullivan to dismiss the case. I don't recommend it to you because it's, a bunch of FBI bashing. It has nothing to do, much of it, with the actual issue. But I found a nugget in there that actually puts the lie to the defense position. And here's how it reads. It's talking about what it means when Rule 48 says that a prosecutor can dismiss the case only with leave of the court. They talk about that in the motion. They say the leave of court provision serves primarily to guard against the prospect that the dismissal is part of a scheme. So the reason a prosecutor can't dismiss a case unless the judge grants the motion, is satisfied that the motion should be granted, is to guard against a scheme. And what we have here, folks, is a scheme. It's a scheme between Bill Barr's unfortunately corrupt upper echelons of the Justice Department and Mike Flynn and his lawyers. They've schemed to tank this case and deprive the people of justice. So this very rule that Judge Emmett Sullivan is following is for this very purpose, to defeat a scheme. I would ask Mike Flynn's defense team one question, and that is, are you saying that if the defendant paid off the prosecutor to dismiss the case, if they had that scheme, you're saying that the judge would have no discretion and would have to dismiss the case, thereby furthering the scheme, facilitating the scheme, enabling the scheme? Is that what you're arguing, Mike Flynn's lawyers? Because the only accurate, correct, acceptable answer to that question is, no, we're not arguing that. Well, then it's all a matter of degree. So I know I've gotten down in the legal weeds a little bit, but it's so infuriating when you have motions that are filed or appeals that are filed that are sort of equal parts frivolous and unconvincing. And that's what Mike Flynn's motion is to the appellate court, his petition for a writ of mandamus. And what I like is the way Judge Sullivan responded to this, not directly because he's not being asked to respond, but Mike Flynn's lawyers filed this petition for review in the appellate court. Judge Emmett Sullivan promptly set a briefing and argument schedule for the parties. You will submit briefs and we will argue this case on July 16th. Pretty clear indication. The appellate court is not going to stop Judge Sullivan from trying to expose this scheme by not being complicit in this scheme. He's going to get to the bottom of it with the assistance of John Gleason. So stay tuned because I think justice is coming in this one. Let's talk a little bit about the development on the Inspector General Mike Pompeo issue. So a quick recap. The Inspector General for the State Department, a gentleman named Steve Linick, longtime public servant, was fired on Friday night, another Friday night massacre by Donald Trump, because Trump said, well, I lost confidence in Steve Linick. And then we come to learn that Steve Linick was investigating, as is his job, Mike Pompeo and the State Department, both for Mike Pompeo apparently misusing some State Department employees to run his personal errands, and far more consequentially, investigating this shady arms deal with the Saudis that we learned about many months ago, that Congress objected to, and then the administration sort of backdoored it. So here's what's important to focus on with respect to this whole ugly incident. The Inspector General for the State Department investigates corruption in the State Department, including potentially by the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State has absolutely no authority to fire the inspector general that is investigating him. Again, that would be like the criminals being able to fire the cops who are investigating them. So Donald Trump, as president, however, does have the authority to fire inspectors general. And on Friday night, he did that because he lost confidence in Steve Linick, said Donald Trump. Today at a press conference.
I don't know anything about him. I don't know anything about him other than the State Department and Mike in particular. I guess they weren't happy with the job he's doing or something. So because it's my right to do it, I said, sure, I'll do it. I've gotten rid of a lot of inspector generals. Every president has. I think every president has gotten rid of probably more than I have.
President, isn't there at least an appearance of a conflict of interest if Secretary Pompeo is asking you to fire an inspector general?
That I can't tell you. I don't think so. I think maybe he thinks he's being treated unfairly. Again, he asked me if that would be possible. I said, I'll do that, sure. I think it should have been done a long time ago, frankly. And this is a man that has had some controversy, this inspector general. But so again, I don't know anything. I haven't even read much about him. I see that it's a little bit of a story, not much of a story, because everybody agrees that I have the absolute right to fire the inspector generals. I think they should have done it a long time ago.
So this is clearly a very thinly disguised workaround of the rules that say the Secretary of State can't fire the inspector general for the State Department investigating him. That is apparently in substance exactly what's happened. So, you know, this is crime and corruption and abuse in plain sight, in the harsh light of day. They're not trying to cover it up. Now, of course, we just learned, a few minutes ago I learned, that Donald Trump also fired the Inspector General for the Transportation Department because apparently he was investigating the Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, Mitch McConnell's wife, for potential corruption. And Donald Trump fired that inspector general as well. You know, the conspiracy indictment that will have to be considered come January is growing and growing and growing by the day because these folks are committing crime after crime after crime, and they're not trying to hide it. And they have to be held accountable for what they're doing to the country, what they're doing to the people, what they're doing to our democracy. And come January, with a law-abiding president and a law-enforcing attorney general, we've got to put a commission together. I've been calling it the Trump Crimes Commission, to hold all of these corrupt politicians accountable for what they're doing. No turning the other cheek, no bygones be bygones, no putting the long national nightmare behind us by declining to hold people accountable. There has to be accountability. There has to be justice. And I do believe it's coming. As always, folks, please stay safe. Please stay coronavirus free. And I look forward to talking with you again tomorrow.